All right, everybody, so welcome back to another episode of Colton Posey Fishing. So today we're going to be talking about transition zones. So transition zones is always good. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're fishing during the spring, summer, fall, winter. It doesn't really matter. Transition zones is always going to be key areas, but in the winter, it really plays a big part. And I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe just bottom composition and stuff like that. Maybe cleaner water. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe stuff heats up a little bit warmer, like rocks and stuff that's shallower in the water, so those fish sit on those transition zones to get a little bit of heat. Not 100% sure, but those areas are productive. So either way, we're going to talk about what those areas are and the baits that I like to use to target those areas. So stay tuned. It's something you don't want to miss. All right, guys, so going over transition zones, what exactly is a transition zone? So it's an area where, it changes from one thing to another, okay? So you may have like this sandy bank, right? It's just super sandy. There's maybe some mussels on it, so just small rocks or something like that. And then all of a sudden it changes over to where it's just like gravel. There's just a bunch of gravel to the other side of that sandy area. A lot of times those fish will set up right as that transition starts. So when it goes from sand to gravel, those fish will be kind of like right there in the middle. It's a great way to pick apart a pattern, because if you find them on maybe they're sitting right in between that sand and that small chunk gravel, if they're sitting right in that area, you can typically run that around the lake. So once you start catching fish there, like I always say, you catch one that doesn't tell you a whole lot, you catch two, you're on to something. Catch three, you better pay attention to what's going on, because you've picked apart a pattern. So other transition zones are pretty simple. I mean, it's the same concept. It may go from big old chunk rock like what's over here beside me to just straight up bluff rock, just a huge drop off. Right as that transitions to that drop off, that's where a lot of fish typically like to sit. A lot of times these fish roam. So maybe it's a flat area with the transition on it. Those fish will typically roam around that area. So make sure you're staying far off the bank this time of year, simply because most lakes are drawing it way down. Lake here, I mean, it's way down from what it usually is. So we're staying a lot further off the bank. We're making sure we're making super long casts no matter where we're throwing, whether that's main lake points or those transition zones, whatever the case may be. So keep off of them. That's one of the big mistakes that I see people make. If you're fishing solo, a lot of times when you find those areas where it transitions and maybe you're catching fish at like the 8-foot mark, right, you can position your boat to where you're staying in that 8-foot zone, and you're keeping your bait in that 8-foot zone the entire time. So you're staying in the strike zone longer. You're going to get a lot more bites by just doing that simple little trick. Now, one of the baits that I really like to use on these transition zones, especially when it comes to pebbles and stuff like that, like pebbles and sand, I like using a Ned rig. A Ned rig is extremely hard to beat during the winter. This is the Z-Man. I use whatever you're comfortable with, but Ned rig's the key, whether you're throwing like that Cinco style bait on it. Maybe you're throwing a crawl, maybe you're throwing a grub, whatever the case may be. But a Ned rig, there's not a whole lot of action. It's super simple to work. Anybody can use one. You're going to drag it most of the time, so you're not really going to be looking to pop that bait or anything like that. You don't want a whole lot of action. You don't want it acting real erratic, simply because everything's cold. So with that being said, finding those transition zones to where the bank goes from sand to pebble, or from pebble to chunk rock, from chunk rock to bluff rock, whatever the case may be, whatever type of transition you're looking at, those are just a few examples. Always check those areas during the winter, especially if you're not on a real good solid pattern, because sometimes you can junk fish and just kind of bounce around from transition to transition and just catch a couple fish. So if you're having a real tough day, always try the transition zones. Don't be afraid to go in the creeks. Typically your creeks is going to have more transition zones than anywhere else on the lake, and you're going to find multiple transition zones from the mouth of the creek to the back of the creek. But 99% of the time I'm going to be focusing on the main lake during the winter. Now here's the thing, there is transition zones on the main lake, on points and stuff like that, that you typically like to fish. And I guarantee you, if you really pay close attention to the bottom composition when you're fishing those main lake points, if you could see it like just through, if the water was erased and you were looking directly at it, you would see that transition zone where those fish are typically hanging out. Now, on your spotted bass fisheries, a lot of times these fish are going to be spread out, or they're going to be grouped up, one of the two. And what I mean by spread out, they're not going to be necessarily one fish here, one fish here. There's going to be a wolf pack of them, 5 to 10 fish, and they're just going to be cruising. And then other times you're going to find them huddled up, maybe close to the bottom or suspended right off the edge of the point. The fish that are huddled up close to the bottom, typically those fish can be caught on stuff like the Ned rigs, the football jigs, swim baits, all kinds of stuff like that. The fish that are cruising, you kind of have to aggravate them enough to get them to bite, and it can be very frustrating for me personally. So, I typically try to find the fish that are, close to the bottom. That way they're just a little bit easier to target. But guys, that's a simple, like a super simple breakdown of what transition zones are. A couple different ways to fish them. I suggest using your winter confidence baits. Me, it's typically going to be that swim bait. It's typically going to be a rock crawler, something simple like that. But either way, guys, I really appreciate it. I'll see you next time.